It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Thomas Grant stood by the large, bay window of his penthouse, gazing out over the sprawling city below. The tall glass panes offered a panoramic view of the skyline, a city filled with opportunities, wealth, and success, all within his grasp. But on this particular day, as the golden sunlight bathed the streets in a warm glow, Thomas felt a heavy weight pressing on his chest. It wasn't the deal he'd closed earlier that morning or the six-figure investment he was about to make that troubled him, it was something far more personal. His son, Luke, lay in the hospital, fighting a battle against a terminal illness that no one, no matter their wealth or status, could fight for him. The doctors had told him weeks ago that there was nothing more they could do. The disease had progressed too far, and his time was running out. Despite all the money in the world, all the resources he could buy, Thomas had been unable to save his boy. Luke's birthday was coming up. The date had been circled on the calendar months in advance. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, one filled with laughter, family, and the promise of new beginnings. But now, with the shadow of illness looming over their home, Thomas knew that this birthday would be different. The excitement he once felt when planning parties for his son, the extravagant decorations, the best entertainers, the biggest cake, none of it seemed as important anymore. The truth was, nothing seemed important except being with Luke in his final days. The house felt strangely quiet as Thomas walked through the halls. His wife, Olivia, was in the kitchen, preparing for the upcoming party, but her smile was more forced than ever before. They hadn't spoken much in recent days. The pressure of Luke's health had strained their marriage, and their once joyful connection had become distant. Their conversations were now about doctors, tests, and the endless appointments that had taken over their lives. They no longer talked about their hopes, dreams, or even the future. It was as if they had both already resigned themselves to the fact that the future was slipping away, and all they could do was hold on to the present. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was something missing. Despite the enormous wealth they had accumulated over the years, despite the grand plans for Luke's birthday party, something felt wrong. He had spent so much of his life building his empire, focusing on his work, his business, his legacy. He had provided for his family, given them everything they could possibly want. But what had he given them beyond material things? What had he truly given to his son, to his wife, to the world around him? The question lingered in his mind, unanswered. As he sat in his office, reviewing some paperwork, the image of a homeless man standing on the corner near his office building flashed into his mind. It wasn't the first time Thomas had seen him. The man, middle-aged with a weathered face, ragged clothes, and a sign that read, "Will work for food," stood at the same intersection every day. Thomas had always passed him by without a second thought, too busy with his own life to acknowledge the man's existence. But today, something was different. For reasons he couldn't explain, the image of that man lingered in his mind. Why, he wondered, did he keep walking past him? Why had he never stopped to offer help? There were shelters, charities, food banks, but that man was still out there, on the street, with no one to offer him anything beyond a passing glance. It was then that an idea began to form, slowly but steadily. It was crazy, but somehow, it felt right. The thought of inviting the homeless to Luke's birthday party seemed preposterous. After all, it was supposed to be a celebration for Luke, not a charity event. But as the idea took root in his mind, it began to feel like something more. A way to show Luke, who had always been so kind and generous, that there was more to life than wealth and privilege. A way to do something meaningful, something real, in the face of their overwhelming loss. Thomas paced back and forth in his office, the weight of his decision heavy in his chest. He knew it would be controversial. The party was going to be a high-profile event, filled with business associates, friends, and family from all over the world. The idea of mixing his circle with the homeless would cause a stir, and there was no way to predict how people would react. His wife would likely object. She had always been the one concerned with appearances, the one who worried about what others would think. But Thomas felt a deep sense of urgency. Luke was running out of time, and he wanted to show his son that life wasn't about status or wealth. It was about connection, compassion, and making a difference in the lives of others. Before he could second-guess himself, Thomas picked up the phone and dialed the number for a local homeless shelter. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. "Hello, this is Sarah," the voice on the other end answered. "Hi, Sarah. This is Thomas Grant. I was wondering if I could speak to someone about possibly inviting a few people to a private event. It's for my son's birthday, and I wanted to do something different this year." There was a long pause on the line, as if Sarah were taken aback by the unexpected request. Of course, Mr. Grant. We'd be happy to help. Can you tell me more about what you have in mind? Thomas explained the situation, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "I want to invite a few people from your shelter to my son's birthday party. It's not a publicity stunt or anything like that. I just think it might be a way to show my son the importance of kindness, of making a real difference. We've always been fortunate, but I want Luke to see that there's more to life than what we have." There was a brief silence before Sarah responded. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Grant. I can certainly help you with that. I'll make sure to find a few people who would appreciate the invitation. I'll also help coordinate transportation." "Thank you, Sarah," Thomas said, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had made the decision, and there was no turning back now. It wasn't just about a birthday party anymore, it was about something deeper, something that could change the way he viewed his life, his family, and his community. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window once more. The city below was still bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, but for the first time in weeks, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this unexpected gesture would be the thing that brought his family closer together and gave Luke a memory that would last beyond the time they had left. As the days passed, preparations for the party continued. Invitations were sent out, decorations were ordered, and the best catering service in town was hired. But in the back of his mind, Thomas couldn't shake the sense of anticipation. How would people react when they saw the homeless guests? Would they accept them, or would they judge them for being out of place? And more importantly, how would Luke react? The answer came the night before the party, when Luke, lying in his hospital bed, looked up at his father and asked, "Dad, who's coming tomorrow? Will it just be the usual guests?" Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, taking his son's frail hand in his. "No, Luke. This year, we're doing something different. Some people who've had a tough time in life are coming. People who don't have much, but who could really use some kindness." Luke's eyes brightened, and for the first time in days, a smile spread across his face. "That sounds amazing, Dad. I think it's perfect." And with that, Thomas knew that no matter what happened the next day, this birthday would be unlike any other. He had made the decision to change the course of his son's life, and in doing so, he would change his own as well. The morning of Luke's birthday arrived with a cloud of anticipation hanging over the Grant household. The staff had been up before dawn, preparing the mansion for what was supposed to be a celebration, a day to make memories, to bring some light into the darkness that had surrounded their family for the past few months. The lavish ballroom was decorated with shimmering gold and silver, streamers cascading from the ceiling, and a massive cake stood in the center, decorated with intricate designs. It was everything a rich, extravagant party should be. But none of it mattered to Thomas. None of the opulence, none of the glitzy displays. His eyes were on his son, who lay in his hospital bed, and his thoughts were fixed on the invitation he had extended to the homeless community. Today was no longer about throwing a grand spectacle for show, today was about change. Thomas stood in front of his mirror, his hand gripping the edge of the mahogany dresser, staring at his reflection with a feeling of uncertainty. He was dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, his appearance flawless as always, but inside, he was a different man. He wasn't sure if this would work, if it would be seen as a noble act or a publicity stunt gone terribly wrong. He had never done anything like this before. As a man who had built his life on business dealings, high-stakes negotiations, and maintaining the perfect image, today's decision felt like a departure from everything he knew. His thoughts were interrupted when Olivia entered the room, her eyes a little puffy from the tears she had tried to hide the night before. "I can't believe we're doing this," she said quietly, almost to herself. "What will people think? Our friends, the guests, the ones who don't know what's happening with Luke. What will they say when they see them?" Her voice cracked with concern, and for a moment, Thomas wondered if he had made the right decision. Olivia had always been the social one, the one concerned with appearances and public perception. She had been hesitant when he first told her about his plan, but she had reluctantly agreed. Now, with the day upon them, her doubt was palpable. "We're doing this because it's what's right," Thomas replied, turning to face her. His voice was calm, but there was a deep conviction in it. "It's not about appearances or what anyone thinks. It's about showing Luke the importance of kindness, of sharing what we have. This is for him, Olivia. This isn't just another party." Olivia's eyes softened, and she nodded, though the unease still lingered in her expression. "I hope you're right. I really do." As the clock ticked closer to the hour of the party, the guests began arriving, filing into the grand hall in their designer gowns, tuxedos, and flashy jewelry. It was exactly as expected: high-profile business partners, old friends, celebrities, and influential figures. The room was a display of wealth, a world of polished smiles and handshakes, where the value of a person was often measured by their name, their wealth, their status. Thomas greeted each guest with a stiff smile, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, but his mind wasn't in the room with them. It was with the people who would soon be arriving, people who had nowhere else to go, people whose names weren't on the guest list, people whose existence was often overlooked. The first of the homeless guests arrived just as the party was starting to fill with chatter and laughter. Thomas had arranged for the shelter to send a van to bring them to the mansion, and the moment the doors opened, there was a palpable shift in the air. The homeless guests, dressed in worn clothes, their faces marked with the wear of hardship and struggle, stepped out of the van and hesitated for a moment as they took in the grandeur of their surroundings. They looked out of place, the contrast between them and the glittering guests around them stark and undeniable. Sarah, the woman from the shelter, stepped forward with a smile, guiding them into the house. They looked around, clearly overwhelmed by the sheer opulence of it all. They had never seen a place like this: grand chandeliers, marble floors, and walls adorned with priceless works of art. It was a world so far removed from their own reality that it almost seemed surreal. "Welcome," Thomas said, stepping forward to greet them, trying to hide the nervousness in his voice. "I'm Thomas Grant. I'm so glad you could make it today." They looked at him with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. They weren't used to being welcomed with open arms in places like this. In fact, most people wouldn't have even looked twice at them on the street, let alone invited them into their home for a celebration. "I'm Sarah," one of them said, a woman in her mid-40s with weathered eyes. We don't know what to say. We've never been to a place like this." Thomas smiled warmly, gesturing to the surrounding guests. "You don't have to say anything. Just enjoy yourselves. Today is about kindness, about sharing a moment. It's about understanding that we're all part of this world, no matter who we are or where we come from." As the group made their way further into the ballroom, the room fell quiet for a moment. The guests, some of whom had just met these individuals, stared in stunned silence. It was a moment of tension, a moment where social boundaries were being pushed. The elite of the city, accustomed to their well-manicured lives, looked at the homeless with a mix of confusion, discomfort, and curiosity. It was clear that not everyone knew how to react. A few whispered to one another, exchanging glances as if unsure how to proceed. But then something unexpected happened. Luke, lying in his hospital bed, saw the group through the large TV screen in his room. His face lit up. "That's them, Dad. That's the people you invited." For the first time in days, Luke smiled with genuine joy, his frail form lighting up the room with warmth. It was clear that this small gesture, this unanticipated shift in the day's events, had meant something deeply profound to him. To Luke, these strangers weren't outcasts. They weren't homeless or different. They were people, just like him. It was a poignant reminder of the simple truths that often get buried beneath the weight of privilege. As the homeless guests mingled with the other attendees, the ice began to break. Some of the guests were hesitant at first, unsure of how to engage. But as the evening wore on, conversations began to flow, and surprising bonds began to form. One of the homeless men, a man named Carl, found himself deep in conversation with an elderly businessman, who had originally turned up his nose at the idea of inviting homeless people to the event. Carl spoke with raw honesty about his life on the streets, about the struggles he had faced and the moments that had shaped him into the person he was today. The businessman, moved by Carl's story, listened intently, his judgment slipping away as he saw the humanity in this man. Across the room, another homeless woman, a quiet figure named Marie, was engaged in a conversation with one of Thomas's high society friends. At first, Marie had been nervous and uncomfortable, unsure of how to fit in. But as the evening wore on, she found herself laughing, connecting with the others in a way she hadn't done in years. Her eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something other than shame. She realized that her worth wasn't defined by the clothes on her back or the circumstances she had found herself in, it was defined by the kindness she shared with others. The event was far from the disaster Thomas had feared. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of awkwardness, moments where the divide between the wealthy and the homeless seemed insurmountable. But there was also something real, a sense of shared humanity that bridged the gap. It wasn't just about the party or the fancy decorations, it was about connection, understanding, and compassion. For once, the social barriers that often separated people were beginning to crumble. Thomas stood by the grand staircase, watching the scene unfold in front of him, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and uncertainty. He had done something unthinkable, and in doing so, he had changed the dynamics of the room. The party was no longer just a celebration of his son's birthday, it had become something far more profound. It had become a moment of reflection, a moment that would linger in the minds of everyone present long after the night ended. And as he watched the homeless guests talking and laughing with the elite, Thomas realized something: the true value of life wasn't in wealth or status, it was in the connections we made, the kindness we showed, and the way we lifted each other up. And just as the night seemed to be winding down, Thomas received an unexpected message. It was from Luke, who had been watching the events unfold from his hospital bed. "Dad," the message read, "this is the best birthday I've ever had. I feel like I'm finally seeing the world the way it should be. Thank you." The celebration was supposed to wind down in the usual way, guests giving their final well wishes, offering congratulations to Luke for surviving another year, for managing to keep his spirits up despite the daily battles he faced with his illness. But just as Thomas was preparing to thank his guests for coming, something happened that would turn the entire evening upside down. A loud crash echoed from the back of the house. It wasn't the sound of plates or glass breaking, nor was it the kind of noise one would expect from a mistake. It was a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the air, instantly silencing the chatter in the room. Thomas's heart skipped a beat as he turned to the source of the noise, his mind racing. Was it a security issue? A mishap with one of the staff? Or worse yet, had something happened to Luke? He pushed his way through the crowd, his mind whirling with possibilities, and reached the back hallway just in time to see the commotion unfold. Two of the homeless guests, Carl and Marie, were standing near a broken display cabinet, staring down at the shattered glass that now littered the floor. Thomas's blood ran cold. The last thing he needed tonight was a scene, especially not one involving his guests. "What happened here?" Thomas asked, his voice strained with concern. He took a deep breath, trying to mask his growing panic. Carl, the man who had earlier shared his story with the elderly businessman, turned to Thomas, his eyes wide with surprise, then glanced down at the broken glass. His hands were raised in a defensive posture, as if bracing for an impending confrontation. I didn't do this," Carl stammered, clearly taken aback by the damage. "Marie and I were just talking, and then someone knocked into the display. We didn't mean for this to happen." Thomas's stomach twisted. He looked around at the gathered crowd, most of them eyeing the situation with a mix of confusion and curiosity. No one had moved to help, and the wealthy guests, who moments ago had been mingling and engaging with the homeless guests, now looked uncomfortable, as though they were unsure how to respond. "What happened?" Olivia's voice came from behind him, and Thomas turned to see her approaching, her eyes scanning the broken glass on the floor. "Accident," Thomas said sharply, though there was a sense of unease in his voice. "Just an accident." But the tension in the air was undeniable. In that moment, something in the room shifted. Thomas couldn't help but notice how the mood had changed so suddenly. The warmth that had been present earlier in the evening, the genuine conversations, the shared laughter, the momentary connection between the homeless and the elite, now felt like a distant memory. It was as if the cracks in the facade of their well-to-do lives had begun to show, and the reality of the situation was settling in. People weren't just uncomfortable because of the broken glass, they were uncomfortable with the idea of these homeless guests being here at all. Marie, standing off to the side, seemed to be the most affected by the scene. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the whispers that were now circulating in the room. "I didn't want to ruin anything." Thomas's heart sank as he saw the hurt in Marie's eyes. He had invited these people to be a part of something meaningful, something transformative, and now it seemed like his gesture of kindness had been reduced to nothing more than a spectacle. He could hear the murmurs of the other guests, the quiet judgment seeping into their voices. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," one guest said under their breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "They're not used to this kind of environment." Another guest, a woman dressed in an expensive cocktail dress, crossed her arms and glanced over at Carl and Marie. "It's a shame. They don't even know how to behave in a place like this." Thomas's blood boiled. He hadn't expected this, not from the people he thought he knew. The people he had considered friends. But just as quickly as the judgment surfaced, something unexpected happened. A man who had been standing off to the side, one of the guests who had been silent throughout the evening, stepped forward. His name was Richard, an entrepreneur who Thomas had known for years, though their interactions had always been limited to business deals and polite exchanges. Richard was in his early 40s, well-groomed, and impeccably dressed. But as he walked toward Carl and Marie, something in his demeanor shifted. He extended his hand to Carl, a gesture that surprised everyone in the room. "Hey, are you okay?" Richard asked, his tone softer than expected. The entire room fell silent, watching as Carl stared at the extended hand, hesitating before shaking it. "I'm fine," Carl said, his voice shaky. "It wasn't my fault." Richard nodded, then turned his attention to the rest of the room. "Let's not forget what this night was about," he said, his voice rising above the quiet whispers. "This wasn't about displays of wealth or looking perfect. This was about showing kindness, about opening our eyes to the people around us. We've all been given opportunities in life, and we should be using that privilege to help, not judge." For a moment, the room stood still. No one spoke, but the shift in atmosphere was palpable. The tension began to ease, though it wasn't completely gone. Richard's words had made an impact, and it was as if the guests were starting to recognize the true purpose of the night. For once, the focus wasn't on luxury or status, it was on people, on relationships, on understanding the humanity that bound them all together. As the evening wore on, the awkwardness began to dissipate. The homeless guests continued to mingle with the others, and though there were still glances exchanged, the conversations became more genuine. Carl and Marie were no longer the focus of whispered gossip but were instead included in conversations, their experiences shared and respected. The party, despite the rocky moment, had turned into something far more meaningful than Thomas had ever anticipated. But as the night progressed, there was one more twist that no one had seen coming. Just as the final guests were beginning to leave, a woman who had been sitting at one of the tables for most of the night stood up and made her way toward Thomas. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, and her hair was streaked with silver. Thomas didn't recognize her, but there was something in her eyes that made him stop. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice steady but with an undeniable edge of emotion. "You may not remember me, but we met years ago. You hired me once for a high-profile project, before all of this. I was one of the first people you worked with when you started your business. And I've been watching you, watching what you've become. You've built an empire, Thomas. But I have to ask you, what's it all worth if you're not willing to look beyond your own walls?" Her words hit Thomas like a freight train. He didn't remember her face, but her statement resonated deeply within him. For the first time in a long while, he began to question his motivations, the choices he had made over the years. Yes, he had built wealth, he had secured power, but what had he done to make the world a better place? What had he done to make a real difference? "I've spent so much time trying to maintain the image, trying to build something I could be proud of," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But I think I forgot to ask myself if any of it really mattered." The woman smiled softly. "It matters, Thomas. But you have to make it count. This is just the beginning. You're on the right path, but don't stop now." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Thomas standing there, her words echoing in his mind. The night had been full of surprises, full of moments that challenged his beliefs and made him rethink everything he thought he knew about life, about people, about kindness. As the last of the guests left, Thomas stood alone in the ballroom, the lights dimming around him. His thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, hope, uncertainty, and a newfound sense of responsibility. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. And no matter how hard it was, he was determined to change, for his son, for the homeless guests who had become part of the evening, for the community at large. This event had reshaped his view of the world, and he knew that he could no longer look away from the struggles of others. In the end, Luke's birthday had been about so much more than just a celebration. It had been about awakening something deep inside him, a realization that the world could be different if only people were willing to see it differently. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt a flicker of hope, a hope that the journey ahead might just be worth everything he had to give. Between the classes. His wealth, which had once served as a symbol of his success, now felt like a wall he had built around himself. A wall that had separated him from understanding the true struggles of others. A wall that had kept him blind to the deeper issues of society. The next few days were filled with uncomfortable conversations and unanswered questions. The media caught wind of the extravagant birthday party that had hosted homeless guests, and soon, Thomas's name was being discussed across the city. His decision to invite people from the streets had made headlines, with some praising him for his generosity, while others accused him of using the homeless as mere props in his bid for attention. Social media exploded with opinions, some calling him a hero, while others labeled him a hypocrite. There were memes, headlines, and countless debates over what his actions truly represented. But Thomas didn't mind the criticism. It was nothing new. He was used to being under the public scrutiny, to having his every move analyzed. What bothered him, however, was the sudden distance he felt from his close friends and colleagues. People who had once been eager to share in his success now looked at him with uncertainty. The looks they gave him were no longer filled with admiration. Instead, they were filled with questions, doubt, and even a touch of resentment. At dinner that evening, his wife, Olivia, sat across from him, her expression contemplative. "Thomas, what are you going to do?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with concern. She had always been his sounding board, the person he could rely on for advice, but this time, she didn't seem to have all the answers either. "I don't know, Olivia," Thomas said, rubbing his forehead in frustration. "I never imagined that doing something good could turn into such a mess. But it's not just about the party anymore. It's about everything that came after. I see people in a different light now, and I don't know how to fix what's broken." Olivia reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "You're not alone in this. But you have to be honest with yourself. Maybe you've been focusing so much on appearances, on success, that you forgot what truly matters. You've been giving and giving, but you've been doing it on your terms. You've been looking for recognition, for validation, but true kindness doesn't come with conditions." Her words struck a chord within him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of truth. His kindness had always been calculated, measured by what he could afford to give, not by the sincerity of his actions. He had been trying to be a good person in his own way, but he had never fully understood what it meant to truly empathize with others. But it was too late to go back now. The decision to open his home had already set things in motion. The ripple effects of that night were being felt across the city, and Thomas knew that he couldn't undo the changes. The damage had been done, but perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen for him to finally understand the power of his privilege. A week later, Thomas made the decision to meet with Carl and Marie. He arranged for them to come to his office, asking them to meet him there for a private conversation. He had no real plan, only a sense that he needed to do more, to understand their perspective more deeply. When Carl and Marie arrived, they were tentative, unsure of what to expect. They had been told that Thomas wanted to speak with them, but neither of them knew the true nature of the conversation. Carl still carried the shame of the broken display at the party, and Marie was still processing the judgment she had felt from the other guests. But as they sat across from Thomas, something shifted. For the first time, Thomas wasn't looking at them as charity cases or symbols of his good deed. He was looking at them as people, as individuals who had their own hopes, dreams, and struggles. "I'm sorry," Thomas began, his voice shaky but sincere. "I invited you to that party because I thought it would be the right thing to do, but I didn't really understand the impact it would have. I wanted to make a difference, but I didn't realize how much I had to learn. And I want to learn. I want to know how I can help, how I can make a real difference." Carl looked at him, his face softening. "You've already done more than most," he said quietly. "Just by inviting us into your world, you've shown us that we matter. But it's not just about you helping us, it's about everyone in this city understanding that we are human. That we deserve respect." Thomas nodded slowly, a deep sense of humility washing over him. This was what he needed to hear, the truth from people who had been living on the margins, people who had been dismissed for so long. It wasn't about him trying to make himself feel better. It was about taking responsibility for the inequality that existed, for the systems that kept people like Carl and Marie in the shadows. As the conversation continued, Thomas felt something shift inside him. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he was willing to search for them. He didn't know how he would change his life, his company, or his community, but he was determined to try. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something much larger, something that went far beyond his own wealth and success. In the weeks that followed, Thomas began to take real action. He partnered with local organizations that focused on providing housing and resources for the homeless. He created programs within his company to hire and train people who had been homeless, giving them a chance to build a future. And most importantly, he began to speak out, using his platform to raise awareness about the challenges faced by those living in poverty. He knew the journey would be difficult. But he also knew that the seeds of change had already been planted. And this time, he wasn't going to let them wither. Months passed after that fateful birthday party, and Thomas began to see the ripples of his decision extend far beyond what he had initially anticipated. The once shifting unease he felt in his heart was gradually replaced by a sense of purpose. He couldn't undo the past, but he could take what he had learned and use it to build something meaningful, not just for himself, but for his community. In the quiet moments, when he found himself alone with his thoughts, Thomas marveled at how much had changed, not only within him but also in the world around him. The first thing that struck him was the change in the way people viewed him. He was no longer the aloof, untouchable figure who sat behind the walls of his wealth and privilege. Instead, he had become someone who was vulnerable, someone who was willing to admit his mistakes and take accountability for his actions. That shift in perception wasn't easy to achieve, it had taken time and deliberate effort. But the more Thomas worked to make a difference, the more he found that people respected him not for his wealth, but for his willingness to evolve, to confront uncomfortable truths, and to embrace the humanity of those who had once seemed like strangers to him. His relationship with Olivia, too, had changed. The conversations they had in those quiet moments, after the media frenzy had died down, became more meaningful. They talked not just about the state of their family, but about the future they both wanted to create. Olivia, too, had seen the transformation in Thomas. She had watched him struggle with guilt, with doubt, and with the pressure of meeting the expectations placed upon him by others. But she also saw a man who was no longer content to simply exist within his bubble of privilege. He had become someone who wanted to actively shape a better world, who was no longer just giving charity, but striving to build lasting change. Their marriage, once caught up in the routines of wealth and comfort, was now infused with a renewed sense of purpose, of collaboration, and of understanding. It wasn't perfect, but they both knew they had grown together, and that their bond was stronger because of the lessons they had learned. But it was the community that had truly begun to shift in ways that left Thomas speechless. When he had first invited Carl, Marie, and the others to the party, he had assumed that the gesture would be an isolated event, a small blip in the radar of his daily life. He never imagined it would serve as the catalyst for such a monumental shift in the attitudes of the people around him. The homeless population, who had always been seen as invisible by many, suddenly found themselves the subject of conversations in boardrooms, in schools, and in families' dinner tables. People who had once looked away now took a hard look at the systems that kept so many trapped in poverty. The notion that homelessness was an issue that could be solved simply by giving handouts was replaced with the realization that real change required empathy, long-term support, and systemic reform. But that change wasn't just happening in the larger community. It was happening at a grassroots level, with individuals stepping up in ways they had never done before. One such individual was Sarah, a local teacher who had spent years working with at-risk youth in the area. She had always been passionate about her students but had never truly understood the depth of the struggles they faced until she saw them through the lens of Thomas's actions. Sarah was one of the first people to attend the charity events Thomas had organized to support homeless families, and it was there that she met people like Carl and Marie, whose stories haunted her for weeks. In her classroom, she began to shift her approach, introducing lessons that addressed not just academic skills, but social issues, encouraging her students to think critically about inequality, poverty, and the role they could play in building a better world. She started a program that allowed her students to volunteer with local shelters and organizations that work to combat homelessness, giving them a sense of ownership and responsibility for the issues that had once seemed distant and abstract. Sarah's efforts soon sparked a wave of community involvement. Businesses, large and small, began to reassess their practices, with some offering jobs and training programs to the homeless. Local restaurants organized food drives, while schools collaborated with charities to provide backpacks, clothing, and supplies to those in need. The ripple effects of Thomas's seemingly small act had ignited a movement, one that wasn't just about giving, it was about creating opportunities, changing perceptions, and fostering empathy. People were no longer content to simply hand out donations, they were committed to transforming lives. But not everyone was happy with this change. There were still those who felt uncomfortable with the attention being placed on homelessness, particularly those who had always viewed the issue as someone else's problem. Some of Thomas's old business associates began to distance themselves from him, whispering behind closed doors that he was losing focus, that he was too caught up in social issues and not paying enough attention to his company. These individuals, once loyal supporters, were now questioning Thomas's commitment to what they saw as the real world, one where business, profit, and status ruled the day. For a time, Thomas questioned whether he was doing the right thing. The voices of doubt crept in, urging him to return to the world he had known before, where things were simple, where problems could be solved with money and influence. But every time he found himself slipping into that mindset, he remembered Carl and Marie, the stories they had shared, the faces of the people who had sat at his table and become more than just a statistic. And he knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. Despite the resistance from some quarters, Thomas was resolute. He had witnessed firsthand the power of a single act of kindness, and he couldn't unsee the faces of those who had been forever changed because of it. The impact of the party was far more than he could have ever anticipated, and now he understood that real change wasn't about grand gestures or one-time acts of charity, it was about fostering a culture of empathy, of giving without expecting anything in return. It was about being willing to confront uncomfortable truths, even when they shook the foundations of one's life. One of the most profound transformations in Thomas's life came when he was approached by Carl, several months after the party. Carl had found a steady job at one of the businesses Thomas had helped create in the community, and he had moved into a small apartment with his wife, Marie. He was no longer living on the streets, but his gratitude went beyond the material. "Thomas," Carl said, standing in front of him one day, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just give me a chance, you gave me my life back. And I'll never forget that. What you did for me, and for everyone else, it changed everything. I'm proud to know you. Proud to call you a friend." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. These weren't words he expected to hear. They weren't words that could ever be bought or earned through wealth or status. They were words that came from the heart, from someone who had been given the opportunity to rebuild their life, who had been seen for who they truly were, not just a homeless person, but a person worthy of dignity and respect. As Thomas reflected on all that had happened, he realized something profound: the true measure of wealth wasn't in the money he had accumulated, or the power he had wielded, but in the lives he had touched, the bridges he had built, and the communities he had helped create. He had begun a journey that he couldn't fully see the end of, but he was no longer afraid to walk it. The lessons he had learned from Carl, Marie, and the countless others who had entered his life over the past few months were invaluable, and they were ones he would carry with him for the rest of his days. And so, as Thomas stood at the crossroads of his past and future, he didn't look back. He kept his eyes forward, knowing that the path he had chosen was one of true purpose. He had transformed not just his life, but the lives of many others, and in doing so, he had found a richness far greater than any wealth could ever offer. A year had passed since that life-changing birthday party, and Thomas sat on the balcony of his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline as the evening sun dipped behind the horizon. His thoughts were distant, yet clear. The once familiar city below him, with its towering skyscrapers and bright lights, had taken on a new meaning. Where once he saw nothing more than opportunities for wealth and success, he now saw faces, families, children, the struggling, the thriving, and all those in between. Thomas had lived a life marked by privilege, yet he was only beginning to realize the vast wealth of experience, community, and growth that existed beyond the borders of his own self-interest. The decision he made that fateful day, inviting homeless people to his son's birthday party, had sparked an unprecedented wave of change, not just within him, but within the very fabric of his community. At first, he had thought it would be a small, fleeting moment, an attempt to right a wrong, an act of charity. But what unfolded was far bigger, more profound, than he had ever imagined. It was a movement, a shift in perception that ignited a spark in the hearts of many. But the journey that followed wasn't just about what Thomas had done. It was about what everyone who had witnessed or participated in the event had come to realize about themselves, about the world, and about the power of a single act of kindness. People who had once seen homelessness as an issue too complex to understand began to look at it through a new lens. They no longer saw homeless individuals as mere statistics or societal problems to be hidden away in shelters. They saw them as human beings, with stories, dreams, and struggles just like their own. Businesses began to think beyond profits, creating job programs, offering services, and investing in solutions to lift people out of poverty. Schools and universities began integrating lessons on empathy and social justice into their curricula, teaching young people to consider the larger community around them and the societal structures that often perpetuated inequality. And all of this started with one invitation, a simple birthday party that opened the doors to a new reality. However, for Thomas, the journey was far from easy. As the media frenzy around the event died down, new challenges began to surface. There were whispers, both from within his circle of wealthy business partners and from the broader community, that he was being too idealistic, too focused on social issues, and that he had begun to neglect his company. These voices were louder than ever, especially when profits began to dip slightly as he invested more in his philanthropic endeavors and less in the cutthroat world of corporate competition. There were those who felt that Thomas's newfound conscience was just a phase, that he was growing soft, that he was letting his emotions cloud his judgment. But Thomas knew better. He could feel in his bones that he had made the right choice. The long-term consequences of his actions weren't about the financial gain, or even the immediate rewards of recognition. It was about something far deeper, something intangible that could not be measured in dollars or power. It was the feeling of seeing lives transformed, of watching people like Carl and Marie break free from the chains of homelessness and build a new future. It was knowing that his own children, Max and Lily, would grow up in a world that had been reshaped by the very act of kindness they had witnessed in their own home. One of the most profound moments came when Thomas received a letter from a local school teacher, Sarah, the same teacher who had been so moved by Carl and Marie's stories that she incorporated them into her lessons. In the letter, Sarah thanked him for helping her see the power of teaching her students not just about math or science, but about empathy, community, and social justice. She spoke about her students, who had once seen homelessness as a distant, abstract issue, and how they had been transformed by the lessons of compassion they had learned in her classroom. Some of her students had even gone on to volunteer in shelters, others had started their own initiatives to support at-risk youth in the community. Sarah spoke of a world that was slowly, but surely, shifting, thanks in large part to the ripple effect of Thomas's invitation to a birthday party that had seemed so small at the time. But it wasn't just the teachers or the schools that had felt the impact. The entire city had begun to change. A local coffee shop, once known for being a quiet and expensive place for business meetings, had opened its doors every Saturday morning to provide free coffee and breakfast to the homeless. A construction company, owned by one of Thomas's former business associates, had launched a program to offer free labor to help renovate shelters and provide homeless families with safe, secure housing. Small businesses began to donate portions of their profits to local nonprofits, and people who had once been hesitant to get involved began showing up, offering their time, their resources, and their skills to help others. The community itself had become more compassionate, more united. People were talking about solutions, not just problems. There were debates, of course, arguments about how best to address systemic issues, whether or not charitable donations were enough, and how to balance the needs of the homeless with the economic demands of the city. But the key difference was that these conversations were happening in the open. They were being driven by the idea that change was possible, that real solutions were within reach if people were willing to look past their own interests and focus on the needs of others. For Thomas, however, the most humbling realization came when Carl, now employed and living with his wife in a small apartment, approached him with gratitude that ran deeper than any check or donation could convey. Carl wasn't just thankful for the chance at a job, or the shelter, or the meals. He was grateful for the dignity that Thomas had shown him, the humanity he had extended by simply treating him as a person rather than a problem. Carl's words, heavy with emotion, stuck with Thomas for days. "You didn't just change my life. You changed how I see the world, and how I see myself." As Thomas stood on the balcony that evening, reflecting on the past year, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The path he had chosen had been difficult, but it had been worth every challenge. He had learned that true success wasn't measured by wealth, power, or status, but by the difference one person could make in the lives of others. He had learned that the power of empathy, when channeled into action, could create a movement that no amount of money could buy. And in doing so, he had built a legacy that would live on far beyond his own lifetime. The world was far from perfect, and Thomas knew that much work remained. But as he watched the sun dip below the skyline, he felt a renewed sense of hope. If a single man could make a difference in such profound ways, what could an entire community do if they came together with a shared sense of purpose? What could the world look like if everyone, regardless of their status or position, chose to see one another, not as strangers, or problems, or obstacles, but as people, each deserving of compassion, understanding, and respect? With those thoughts in mind, Thomas made a vow to continue his work, to never stop fighting for the transformation of his community, for the people who had been overlooked for far too long, and for a world where kindness wasn't just an occasional act, but a way of life. He knew the road ahead would be long, and at times, the weight of it would feel heavy. But he also knew that he wasn't walking it alone. The legacy of that birthday party, the legacy of one small, but powerful decision, would live on, igniting change for years to come.